Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on 10 proven L&D strategies for teaching today's most important skills. Today, we're really focused on the science of collaborative learning, why it works, and specifically, we're going to talk about 10 proven strategies for boosting attendance, engagement, skill building, and application in the workplace. Do you want to begin by getting you familiar with your speakers today? I'll get started and then I'll pass the mic to Alex. My name is Kaylin Cooney. I am a learning strategist here at Hone. My role is ultimately to collaborate with our learning partners to design really incredible learning journeys and to measure the impact of those learning journeys and make sure that they're really successful. My background is in industrial organizational psychology with a focus on learning and development. So this is absolutely something I'm passionate about and excited to be here with Alex today to talk about these things. So Alex, would love to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kaylin. Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Kurgan. I have about 17 years of experience in L&D. At one point, I was the principal learning experience designer at Hone. I've gone on to found something called People Hat, which is a marketplace for L&D buyers to match with. So if you have any L&D needs and you're looking for very specific requirements, we're a free service for you to use to get like 5 to 10 high quality proposals. Again, totally free. Check out peoplehat.com. Thank you.
I'll give you a little bit of background on Hone before we turn it over to Alex officially. If you're not familiar with Hone, what do? We provide a next-gen learning platform that combines live virtual classes with expert coaches and a very cutting-edge program management technology for effective and scalable training. We have the largest content library of its kind, which allows us to empower learning leaders to run live programs for all of their employee audiences using one simple subscription. What does that look like? We have over 100 classes in our course catalog that are on today's most critical skills, things like communication, collaboration, conflict management, and leadership. All of our classes are going to be live and collaborative experiences, and that's because we have a strong belief that power skills, social skills are going to be learned socially. We have an amazing platform that automates your program admin, your logistics, and your learner comms to ease your lift in executing programs. And then we also have an in-house team of learning solutions experts, that's my team, who are here to help advise you on your specific learning strategy with our product. Ultimately, we're really dedicated to transforming employee performance, retention, and engagement to ensure that we're delivering a learning experience that drives real ROI and lasting behavior change in organizations. And we've invested years into mastering what collaborative learning looks like and what makes it effective. After teaching hundreds of thousands of learners, we like to think we know a thing or two about how to do it right. And so in today's session, Alex is going to be sharing the science of collaborative learning, the secrets behind this world-class training methodology, and the ways that it can produce real outcomes for the organizations that we are really proud to partner with. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex to dig in.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. I'd like to start this off by saying something that I think everybody knows is true, but we kind of take for granted, and that's that there are no islands in a modern organization, meaning that for people who work together in teams, the majority of skills that help you do your job well involve either interacting with your teammates, interacting with customers, or both. It's very rare that you have a job that doesn't require doing one of these things all the time. And so it makes sense to focus on soft skills and people skills and leadership skills, or what Hone calls power skills. But all of these things, even technical skills, fall under this vast umbrella of human interaction. So think about the last time you worked on even a technical project where at some point you didn't have to collaborate with someone to define a goal, or maybe you had to ask for feedback along the way. Or maybe you did all this work completely alone, but then at the end of it, you had to persuasively present the final product to your colleagues or to customers. So it follows that if you want to upskill people in your organization on how to more effectively navigate all of these human interactions that we're always undertaking at work, it makes sense that you wouldn't want to skimp on human interaction in the actual learning. And yet there's this rising trend of employees who receive mostly or even only e-learning, missing out on a few important benefits of learning together live with other people. And likewise, any trends around like AI coaching or something like that, those things are great. Those tools can be great, but they're not examples of actual human interaction. And so you end up missing out on benefits. So one of these benefits is realistic practice. So if you want to get people to learn skills like coaching or persuasively communicating or giving really good feedback, it makes sense that you would learn those skills directly from an expert coach who's actually modeling them for you. And then you get to practice those skills live with other people. Again, an AI is great. It gives you some practice, but it's not an actual person yet, really, who's like genuinely reacting to you. You get to see their facial expressions and all of that stuff. A second major benefit of learning collaboratively with other people is that it gives you, as a learning leader, a lot of leverage over motivation. So when learners are placed into a classroom with their peers, they're going to feel some shared accountability. They're going to feel motivated to participate in small group exercises so that they're not letting their group down. They get to try out their reflections or ideas or skills in the presence of others, and they might hear validation, might hear, hey, that's a great idea, or really good job working on this. And that's a really powerful motivator. A third major benefit is scale, especially when you're doing collaborative learning in a live virtual kind of modality, which is what Hone does. So first off, in a classroom, if everyone gets to see and hear each other kind of admitting to challenges or weaknesses, sharing their goals and aspirations, all of that stuff, it sets the message that everybody has something to learn and that everyone cares about each other's growth and success. And again, because you're potentially doing this in a live virtual way, you can scale collaborative learning while saving money because you don't have to worry about getting classrooms and getting, worry about travel costs and all that stuff. And finally, there's just a pure human connection benefit, which is going to become increasingly more valuable as our lives get mediated by AIs and other advanced technologies. Just having FaceTime with other people is going to be valuable in itself. We've evolved to like that and need it, and we can't just in a snap turn off that part of our evolution. So if you want to put collaborative learning into practice and reap all of these different benefits, there are 5 essential elements to include. And these elements were defined by Roger and David Johnson. I don't think they're are they brothers? They might be brothers. They're 2 Johnsons, and they worked on cooperative learning, which is a form of collaborative learning that includes a common goal, and they define these essential elements. So for cooperative learning or collaborative learning to be successful, you need a few things. One is positive interdependence, meaning learners are depending on each other in some way. So for example, you might have group exercises, as I mentioned, where learners are relying on each other to fulfill their part of the exercise. If there's some individual and group accountability, that also helps. So expecting learners to have their cameras on and participate fully in each individual and group activity is an example of that. There's something else that the 2 Johnsons define, which is promotive interaction, which means getting learners to discuss concepts, to do group work in an encouraging and supportive way, especially while they're able to see each other's faces. Relatedly, another element is using social skills, so requiring that learners ask each other questions, give each other feedback, or otherwise collaborate using social skills. And the last element is group processing, so discussion among the group about how well they're working together and achieving their goals. And these principles are great in the abstract, but what we're going to do over the next 20 to 30 minutes is try to give you some vivid and practical examples of these things and talk about Hone's expertise in actually applying these principles that we've accrued or that Hone has accrued over the last 5 years or so of facilitating live virtual collaborative learning experiences. As we go through this, please throw your questions or comments or anything you want us to dive deeper into the chat, and I'll try to get to those as we go through. And if not, we have time left over at the end for Q&A. So let's continue with 10 proven L&D strategies for teaching today's most important skills. Or here's how, another way of saying this is how Hone has adapted the science of collaborative learning and put it into practice. And it all starts with attendance. So we often use the LTEM model developed by Dr. Will Thalheimer. This I think is a superior alternative to the Kirkpatrick model, which you're probably familiar with. and it spells out what you might want to measure in your programs. And it's also kind of a roadmap that doubles as a list of outcomes that you're trying to drive. And the journey to these outcomes, right? You're trying to get people to have decision-making competence and task competence and transfer and see those positive effects of transfer. Those are the ideal outcomes. And so that begins unavoidably with attendance. You have to get people to actually come to the sessions. And the biggest barrier to getting people to do that is busyness, because people working in organizations tend to be busy. And even when they aren't, they may think or say they are, right? And that's fair enough. We don't need to burst that fantasy. Everyone's going to aggressively defend the idea that they're very busy. So instead of negotiating with people about their schedules or trying to coax them to make learning a priority, Hone has found two tactics particularly helpful. The first is sometimes the best option, which is just to put a class on someone's calendar in an empty slot. Now, we call this forced enrollment. It's a lot nicer than it sounds, especially when you have some flexibility built in. And what happens here is a class magically appears on someone's calendar. You've created this natural behavioral trigger to attend. You've also removed the work required to actually register for the class because you're doing it for them. And it feels a little bit like a mandate. So there's some increased motivation to attend, right? Oh, my learning leader, my manager has put this on my calendar for a couple of weeks down the line. I'm going to attend. The downside is that sometimes you'll have people with conflicts. Oh, I can't attend this class that you put on my calendar. And so it really helps to have the flexibility part of it, which means you have multiple makeup options and sessions offered at different times of day. And using this approach, Hone customers routinely get over 90% attendance and program completion. Another way to mandate enrollment bakes that flexibility in from the start. So rather than adding a class on somebody's calendar, you can just create a set of open slots and invite people to sign up. So here are all the slots that we have available. Please sign up for one of these. It creates a little bit of extra work where someone actually has to go and click and they have to sign up, but there's also less chance of there being a conflict. So depending on the kind of specifics of your organization, one of these two options, forced enrollment or open enrollment, might make more sense. And the key, if you're going to use open enrollment, is to constantly just be nudging people and reminding them to sign up and being clear in your messages that although you can choose which slot you want, you have to choose one, or it's highly advised that you choose one, depending on the kind of program you're trying to run. Another really effective strategy for getting people to actually attend classes or collaborative learning sessions is to get executives to sell the benefits of the program. So what should they actually say in their endorsements? The best thing to communicate to learners are three things. What am I going to get out of this program or class? How is it going to make my life easier or better? And then why is it so important to the company right now? And executives who don't just endorse, but also actually participate in the sessions, they send a powerful message that they really care about the training or the learning experience. And, they're visibly attending. If that's not possible, that's okay. Even a testimonial from an executive who once went through a program can be shown over and over for new recruits or new cohorts. And either way, the point is to visibly demonstrate that if it's worth the executive's time, or it's worth the time for the executive to actually list out, here's why it's so important, here's what you're going to get out of it, then it's worth everybody's time. One more thing for attendance, and I'd really like to focus on this step because I think it is both largely neglected and also, to my mind, the single most important thing for any L&D person to grasp. And that's this idea of a moment of need and how it relates to motivation. So as we approach what is called a moment of need, so some event, some deadline, some date coming up in the future that's really important, or maybe one that just happened, there's a motivational window that gets opened up during which people are willing to learn, and not just willing, but sometimes desperately willing, because they have a need and it's a pain, and learning is the painkiller. So for example, say you have a presentation to give on some unfamiliar topic 1 year from now. Say you have to give a presentation on antimicrobial resistance. How motivated would you be to learn about the topic right now if you had the presentation a year from now? How much pain would you feel? You might not spare a single thought for it. Okay, what if the presentation were 1 month from now? Maybe then you start feeling something. Now imagine it's 2 weeks away or 1 week away and it's go time. You're like, I need to learn this thing. I need to not look like a fool. I need to do all this work. I need to learn. I will learn anything I need to learn in order to do well or to not look like a fool, depending on you. You might be on one of those poles. Both of those are super motivating, depending on the kind of person you are. And then if the presentation's tomorrow on some unfamiliar thing, now you're like really screwed. You're really motivated. Okay. So there's this window that gets opened up about a month to a few weeks out before something where you're super motivated to learn and you have time to learn. And this window works in reverse too. After you deliver the presentation, I imagine that you just delivered a presentation and immediately after I was like, hey, I have some feedback for you. You'd be pretty interested to hear it. What if it were a day after the presentation? Okay. What if it were a month after? Would you care at all? If it was a year after, would you even know what I'm talking about? So we have to really respect the fact that there's this time when people are super motivated to learn. And if we don't put learning in that window, we are actively distracting someone from a need, from a different need that they have that is completely top of mind for them. So these needs are pretty continuous phenomenon. If at any point throughout the week I were to ask you or you were to ask somebody, what do you need to do today? You could answer that question. If I were to ask you, what is your goal for today? It would be harder to answer that question. You might get confused looks or pauses or anxious silences because people have goals long term, but in general, they're operating on a daily timeline of needs, which have an urgency to them. So ideally, we are matching learning experiences to those needs in order to get people to attend and to actively engage and actually apply what they're learning. And the beauty of the Hone membership product is that it allows people for maybe the first time ever to rather than what like if you have a need, a lot of times you're like, oh, I'm just going to watch a video or ask somebody a question, or I'm going to ask AI, or I'm just going to wing it. It's very rare that you have the opportunity to just jump into a class when you have a perceived need, but that's what Hone membership allows you to do. Cassandra mentions DEI trainings are slightly different, though. There's no specific moment of need to learn unless there's been an incident in the news and the company's all over it. How do you still implement a training when there isn't a specific moment of need? So, great question. So, this is where you would create a moment. So, it's like, hey, we have this organizational goal or project this quarter and we have these DEI KPIs that we're trying to hit by the end of the quarter, and it's really important, and people are going to be evaluated based on them. Something like that. That's an example. Maybe you can't do that specifically, but now you have a setup. You have a time that everyone is looking for. Something needs to be done by the end of the quarter. It's somehow tied to people's performance goals or what they're expected. And now you can create training that's based around that organizational moment of need that you've created from scratch, right? You can always create a moment of need from scratch. If you give somebody a project that has a deadline, you've out of nothing created this moment that they're super willing to learn for, and then you can put learning around that. Yeah, hope that answers your question. So let's take a look at an example of, let's make this really practical. So let's say you have Q1 planning coming up. That's a perfect opportunity for everybody in the company to have some learning experiences around things like setting goals or setting OKRs or setting strategy, depending on their level. And doing so not only helps you vastly broaden your scale and thus your total impact, but you're also likely to create synergistic effects. So if everybody's learning the same kinds of stuff around a shared moment of need, like Q1 planning, that knowledge is going to percolate at different levels. And just imagine, again, if you assign someone training around goal setting at a time when they're not setting goals, it's like, why are you doing this? You're distracting me. I have something else on my mind, right? So this is to say, and again, the reason why I said this chart or understanding the value of this chart is like the most important thing and any L&D person can grasp is that if you don't do that, you are starting from a negative position. You're not just at a neutral position where you have to motivate someone. Someone has existing motivations that you have to fight against in order to get them to actually do something that you want. And it's frankly almost impossible to do that depending on the person. Whereas by thinking about moments of need and putting learning around those moments is a way of riding natural motivation waves. And you don't have to worry about all of that motivation, which is honestly the hardest part. Okay. So attendance. We're enrolling people automatically or giving them this open enrollment option. We're giving them reasons why they should really attend as articulated by people that they really respect in the organization, so certain senior executives. And we're tying learning to moments of need that make a lot of sense. They give you opportunities to actually apply what you've learned and create natural moments of motivation. Okay, so now people are in your class. You have attendance under your belt. You can start looking at the next tier of the LTEM model, which is activity. And it's tempting to see this tier and think, okay, I'm going to design these maximally interactive sessions. But as we know, interactivity for its own sake doesn't really accomplish anything. In fact, the more people are having fun in a class, the less they're learning potentially. And to some extent, that's really genuinely true because actual learning is hard. It physically hurts a little bit. And so we need to be really thoughtful about the type of activity we're trying to boost. So at home, this starts with setting expectations that active participation by everyone is the norm because it's super tempting to multitask, especially in a live virtual context. That's the one downside of live virtual, which is that in a real classroom, people, it's harder to multitask. It's obvious when you're like picking up your phone and looking at something, right? It actually, I think, has become more obvious for people in a live virtual setting. I'm sure you've been in a Zoom meeting where you can see that someone's like eyes are wandering and they're looking at multiple screens or they're clearly not paying attention. I would say at like every all hands meeting ever, you'll see like at least 50% of people doing that, and it's kind of accepted. But in a class, we're not accepting that. A class is not a meeting. And we set expectations that you need to be actively participating. A class is not an opportunity to eat a sandwich with your video off. And with very few exceptions, just about every learner in every organization agrees to these house agreements that Hone sets out at the beginning. So once people have made a commitment to actively participate, it's important to actually reward them with an experience that's easy to follow. And with that in mind, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the multimedia principles based on the work of educational psychologist Richard Mayer. These principles will help you present information in a way that does not overload the brains of learners. So for example, there's something called the segmenting principle, which states that you should break learning experiences into chunks that don't overload working memory. So here, for example, I'm presenting items one at a time. There's something called the coherence principle, which states that you should limit or eliminate the use of irrelevant images or slide decorations. You know, people love putting animated GIFs into slides. It's like a defense mechanism. You're like insecure that people are not going to like your slides. And so you drop in some random like GIF or joke or something like that. Ultimately, it just ends up distracting people from the actual content. So we want to avoid that. Another important principle is something called the redundancy principle, which states that you should avoid reading text from a slide verbatim. So you use the slide as a brief outline and then you elaborate verbally. Sorry. Or if a graph is shown, you explain it verbally without also providing the textual explanation on the slide. What ends up happening, and this is a top concern with almost every PowerPoint presentation I've ever seen, you have a bunch of text and the text is presented. So what do people do when text is presented? They start reading. But then as that person is reading, the facilitator is reciting that text to them in their own voice and at their own pace. And the reading, you start getting distracted from the reading with what you're hearing. And there's this redundancy problem that creates interference in a way. And this is super common. So we want to avoid this. Lastly, I want to talk about the signaling principle, where we want to highlight or bold essential text or put things up one at a time. And that's kind of related to this segmenting principle as well. And there are a bunch of other principles, 8 other ones. So there are 12 total that it probably makes sense to familiarize yourself with. And the reason is that small violations of these principles, they can quickly add up to cognitive overload. So you may have a few really text-heavy slides, and after a couple minutes, people are checked out. Their eyes start to glaze over, and that can be hard to come back from. Let's take a look at some examples. So think to yourself, and I know this is a slide, this is kind of a meta thing. It's a slide within a slide, but just look at this portion here. So what's going on here? It looks fine, right? From like maybe like a aesthetic perspective, but for learning, it has several problems. So it violates the coherence principle, where there's all this irrelevant imagery. Like, what is this person doing here? Just some decoration. A lot of slide templates have random decorations that reduce the amount of space there is on the slide to actually put content and just do literally nothing. It again feels like a defense mechanism where if you're not like a super artistic person, which like most people are not, then you're like, okay, I have to have some kind of visual treat here, so I'm going to throw this thing in here. It's going to end up being irrelevant and distracting. There's also a signaling principle here where you're not sure where to look at on the slide. There's all this stuff, it's presented at once. And there's probably a redundancy issue where you have this text on the left. This is like a full sentence. It's a fairly complicated sentence. Somebody's going to stop and read it while at the same time the facilitator is presenting it. Okay, let's make this slide a little better. Let's get rid of the coherence issue. We no longer have irrelevant imagery. We don't need all of these different examples. Let's just have one example. Okay, it's a little better, more coherence, but we still have this problem with signaling and potentially redundancy where we're not sure where to look. These things are slightly far apart, and there's all this text here, and facilitator is going to be tempted to read it while you're reading it. Okay. What about this? Here we go. We have four words that are very quick to read, keep slide design simple, and then an image that helps serve as an example of that, right? This is Steve Jobs standing in front of a very simply designed presentation. And the image hints at or serves as an example, but the ball is now in the facilitator's court to actually bring this to life. And that's what you want to be doing as a facilitator, and that's what home facilitators do. So this is nice. I don't think this violates any of the principles. And again, the way that you can use these principles is maybe looking at existing materials that you have and trying to update slides based on the principles. You'll probably find that you have a lot of slides or a lot of materials that violate at least some of these principles. And so there may need to be a single revamp of all your materials. And it makes a big difference. It's like this is what the learner is experiencing as they're going through the class, right? If there's some visual materials, and the more cognitive load it takes to actually process all of the stuff that they're looking at, the less energy they have for practice and for discussion and all of that. Another really important element of engagement is thinking about not just what's happening within the actual learning experience, but also how long is the learning experience? Because collaborative learning is pretty effortful. And so Hone recommends to keep sessions between something like 30 minutes to 2 hours in length. How much we can learn at once is limited by biological factors. So there's something called the basic rest activity cycle, which roughly gives you about 90 minutes to 2 hours of full on focus. Even if you're really interested in something, you're probably going to start to feel tired or distracted after that. So you might get into what's called a flow state. You might find that work is coming really easily. You enjoy it so much. Even if you're in that state, it's hard to keep that going for more than about 2 hours before you need a break. Likewise, our memories are also limited, such that sessions that have too much information may overload our capacity for consolidation, meaning whatever we're learning, it's not going to get stabilized into long-term memory. So think of 30 minutes to 2 hours as this kind of sweet spot where if you have longer sessions, they're likely to overload and tire out learners, and shorter sessions than 30 minutes are probably going to cut into practice time. So it's not really going to be a real learning experience, a real collaborative learning experience, at least. Probably be more like a lecture, and that's it. So for these reasons, nearly every class in Hone's catalog is about an hour long, with a few 90-minute and 2 hour long exceptions. And as I mentioned, sessions, you could do something between 30 minutes or an hour, but then you start to really get into significant trade-offs between the actual instruction and the collaboration part. So in general, Hone sets an hour as the minimum. Okay, so let's quickly recap this engagement section. So if we want people, so they're attending, they're in the class, we want them to participate, we want some activity. So we set our house agreements at the beginning to get people to commit to participating, have their cameras on, all of that. We then give them a delightful experience that doesn't overload their brains because it doesn't have a ton of information on every slide and you don't know where to look and all of that stuff. So we give them simple slide designs without a lot of text and we bring them to life. And then we're doing this all within the guardrails of, roughly 30 minutes to 2 hours so that people aren't getting tired out just based on their natural limitations we all have. Okay. Now let's get into the actual work of the class or, what we're doing in L&D in general, which is we're trying to actually change people's behaviors or give them more skills. And so how do you do that in a collaborative learning context? It's easy to think about like you can talk up collaborative learning and it's like it sounds so great, right? And so you can totally drink the Kool-Aid on it. I recommend you do. It's delicious Kool-Aid. But that doesn't mean that the only thing that you're doing in a class is working collaboratively in small groups. And the reason is that even though people actually prefer to kind of discover things on their own rather than learn from just direct instruction, unfortunately, they learn less that way. And it's because our working memory is pretty restricted. So the cognitive load required to figure things out for ourselves, if we just jump into something and we start doing it ourselves, we start talking to other people who maybe don't know that much either, we're cutting into our capacity to actually durably learn anything because we're spending too much time searching and trying to figure things out. So research supports first learning from direct instruction. So having a coach, facilitator, expert who really knows what they're talking about, present some information initially, and then gradually fading guidance over time. So here's an example of what that looks like. So at Hone, every class generally starts by presenting a framework or model. And this may look like a flow chart or a series of steps or a table or a Venn diagram or some other visual representation. And Hone discusses the framework or model overall before showing how each of the parts relate to each other. And this direct instruction first, it helps learners comprehend and remember each of the steps, more so than if they were simply shown the model or framework and told to use it. So if you were just shown, here's the GROW model, go use it to coach somebody, it's hard, really hard. If you're shown, here's the GROW model, here are the steps of the GROW model, here's why these steps are in this order, and here's how they connect. And let's look at some examples of this. Now you can really start to wrap your brain around GROW and how you might start to apply it. As an example, we had a model today in today's webinar, even though this is not really a collaborative learning experience per se, we'll have some elements of that in the Q&A. We have this model or framework that helps explain or tie all of the information together in some way. So then once you present the model, you can start to play around with it. And so the next move might be some scaffolded group practice. So before getting everybody to individually practice stuff, you might do some instructional exercise that the facilitator runs and makes a little bit easier. So scaffolding means making any instructional exercise easier through some form of support. So for example, a facilitator may present a difficult problem and talk about the steps that they would use to approach it. Or the facilitator may present a case study and prompt learners to think step by step about how the framework or model applies to the example. So like, let's say somebody came up to you and said XYZ. How might you use the GROW model with them? Okay, let's take this one step at a time. What questions would you ask about their goal? Right? That's an example. Or you might guide one learner through a kind of low difficulty role play and then discuss the whole thing as a group. One common approach that's used by Hone is to have each learner take turns practicing while guided by the coach. So for example, this is an example of this kind of scaffolded group practice from Hone's class on asking powerful questions. So we present these 4 question types that are visible here on the right. So we had this model that's open, closed, story, and hypothetical. These are 4 different question types. We talked about how they relate, when you would use each one. And then we have learners take turns asking the coach, in this case, it's Shiba, questions. And first they name the type of question they're asking. So they would say, okay, Shiba, open question. How did you become a practitioner of DISC? Or Shiba, closed question. Do you prefer the Tilt 365 exam to or assessment to five behaviors of a cohesive team? Something like that. Or and again, those are just ways of in a group context that's low stakes, practicing something where you're just taking it a little bit at a time. It also gives the coach information as to how well learners actually understand the material. So if you're helping people practice in a group first, you can kind of assess, oh, actually, people don't really get this point. I have to reiterate it before I have them practice individually. George is asking me very good examples of open questions. Where did I go to school? What area of study? Was it industrial organizational psychology? I went to Amherst College and I studied philosophy. And then I picked up educational technology and L&D and all of that stuff kind of as I went along in my career from the beginning. Thank you, George, for modeling this scaffolded group practice. Appreciate it. Okay. So you present a model or framework, you have people practice applying it in some group context that's low stakes, where the coach or facilitator can kind of figure out how much people have learned. And then you can move on to independent practice. So it's kind of ironic that one of the best uses of of a collaborative learning environment is to actually have people do individual practice, as long as you bring those people back into small groups afterward to get feedback and discuss challenges and so on. And a really especially useful version of this is to get people to immediately apply what they're learning to their actual work. So, for example, Hone has a class on developing an effective strategy, and everyone in the class does what's called a TOES analysis, which is a more sophisticated version of SWOT. And this is real useful work. So each leader in the class uses this time to develop a focused and differentiated strategy that can help determine upcoming team goals and priorities. And so they do this 10-minute exercise. This is a 2-hour class. There's more time to do like 10, 12 minutes individually. And then after leaders actually fill out this TOES analysis and try to use it to develop a strategy, they come back into groups and they talk about, how did you come to decide on your strategy? What other tempting strategies did you have to say no to? What are your assumptions about how this strategy might work, and how might you validate those assumptions? And so this brings us to the kind of bread and butter of Hone classes, which is the breakout room. And when you ask learners almost universally their favorite part of a Hone class, the vast majority say the breakout rooms. And our Hone's instructional designers, coaches, try not to take this as an insult, because we know that humans are biologically compelled to talk about ourselves. There was a really interesting study where Harvard researchers used fMRI brain scans to show that when people talk about themselves, it triggers the same feelings or similar feelings in similar parts of the brain as if you were eating delicious food. In fact, participants in the same study were willing to give up 17% of the reward money that they had earned as part of the experiment if it meant that they got to talk about themselves rather than about other people. So when you put people into breakouts, most of them are really going to relish this opportunity to talk about themselves. And that's nice. That's good for session ratings. They're going to love it. You put people in breakout rooms, they're going to give you a 5 out of 5. But that in itself doesn't really help build any skills. So what does? Well, Hone likes to create breakout exercises that might serve multiple purposes at once. So take a look at these examples. I'll let you read through this one first. So this is one example of a kind of breakout room. Here's another one. So this one is first one's more reflection, discussion. The second one is role play, right? So in the abstract, I'll just tell you some other versions. So sometimes someone will have each person present the work they did in the individual exercise and then give each other feedback. So that happens after this, when people actually build their strategy, they come together and discuss and give each other feedback. Sometimes every person will take turns giving their answers to a few prompts, and then you discuss that. So that's kind of like this first one. Two people role play and the third person takes notes and they're an observer. And when the role play is over, the observer gives their feedback and then they switch roles. So that's more like this second breakout room here. Sometimes an entire group will do an activity together and then they present their results to the broader group. So there's a decision-making class that Hone does where everybody gets together and works on a difficult decision, but they do it in their groups and they do the work together, and then they come back together and say, here's how we made the decision, and here's how we allocated roles in the decision-making process and all that stuff. So these are all different options. And in each of these examples, people are reinforcing what they're learning about by talking about it. And a couple other things to note about these breakout rooms, they tend to be like 10 to 12 minutes long. Generally, there are like 3 people in each group. Sometimes, if you have a more sensitive conversation, like in a DEI class, you might want to keep breakout groups to like 2 people if there's a more intimate conversation that's happening. And in rare cases, it might make sense to have a larger group go through something. So as I mentioned, that decision-making exercise, actually have like 4 or 5 people together in a group, because that's to get to the dynamics of the different roles in decision making. But on average, you're looking at 3 people, 10 to 12 minutes per breakout. Just going to look in the. Liz is mentioning, do you find people are getting breakout fatigue? We're experiencing a little bit of that lately. I don't think that's an issue if the breakouts are very obviously used for a specific purpose. So, like, there isn't, in general, there isn't like an icebreaker breakout that happens at the beginning of a class where people are just doing that to like get to know each other for a second. Every breakout is like, we just learned something. Let's go practice that together in a group. And it's really obvious and there's a purpose to it. And so it feels a little bit more motivating in that respect. But it might be that like people, if you have a ton of live virtual meetings and people are just getting breakout fatigue, you might want to space these sessions out a little bit more. That's one option. Robin mentions breakout rooms, like every other interactivity or engagement, must be used to complement your content. You have to have a goal and purpose to enhance your learning content. I don't use breakouts in every curriculum or program. Another way of saying what I was saying, although I would, having built like 70 classes or something for home over the last few years, I do think there's a useful way of putting breakouts into every curriculum or program, as long as you're using a potentially broad variety of breakout types. So as I mentioned, you could do role plays, you can do discussions, you can do group activities, and so on. And sometimes one might not work, or people have fatigue about one kind. You might try another one. But Robin, I don't doubt your expertise here. So there may indeed be some programs where it just doesn't make sense, and I'm not thinking of them. And then Louise mentions, how long are we spending actually debriefing these breakouts? Something like 3 to 5 minutes. So it depends kind of, it's up to the facilitator to feel that out. But yeah, sometimes each breakout room might be presenting something afterward. Sometimes the facilitator might just ask, okay, what did you have in common that you thought was really interesting in the discussion? Or what did you learn, or whatever, and that kicks off the conversation. Okay. So before we get to application, really quick recap. So we're building skills by giving people some framework or model to wrap their brains around. Then we're moving on to some scaffolded group practice where the coach can kind of suss out how are people understanding this, and giving people opportunities to practice in a low stakes environment. And then we're moving on to independent practice, followed by some breakout conversations that turn that independent practice into a collaborative learning experience where people get feedback and so forth, which leads us to the last part, which is application. And so remember, in our learning transfer evaluation model, attendance is first. We want to get people to attend. We want to get them to really engage and show activity. But then as we're building up knowledge and skills through practice and whatever, we want to get to application at the end, right? The whole point of what we're doing is to get to transfer. And a few really important things that Hone has learned about transfer and application is that it really helps to get people to make commitments during a class. So at the end of every hone class, learners take a short survey reflecting on their experience, and one of the questions asks participants to make a commitment related to what they've learned in class. And that helps them reflect on what they've learned and synthesize it, plan on how they might implement it, and also feel some obligation for following through. And to actually get them to make that commitment, it's important to get them to do it before the class is over. If you wait and have people make their commitments after the class, completion rates plummet. And you could send post-class reminders to people to make the commitment. In fact, you can mandate that learners actually make a commitment to earn credit for the class. but there's something kind of special that happens in the class itself. The content is super fresh, and someone can be like, you know what, this is how I'm going to apply it. And they have this kind of built-in motivation, mini motivation that gets created, and it's helpful to capture that before the class is over. We generally send this survey out like 3 to 5 minutes before the end of the class, so people have some time to actually do it. And in some cases, we may even have a breakout room where people discuss their commitments. So, for example, if you have a bunch of leaders together in a class on, setting strategy or developing a psychologically safe culture, there may be the last breakout room might be, okay, what are you actually going to do? How are you going to apply this stuff? What challenges do you foresee? What support might you need from other learners to actually get this done and stuff like that. So you start talking about the application. And a really helpful tool to help people set the right kinds of commitments is something called trigger action planning. And this is one version of it where you create a goal situation action plan. So you can ask these 3 questions for people. So what is your goal? In what situation are you going to actually do this? And what specific action are you going to take? And by structuring your commitment in this way, research suggests you're roughly 70% more likely to complete a commitment than if you were to just write out, I'm going to do X. So it's called a trigger action plan or an implementation intention. There's a lot of really good research here that I recommend if you're interested in it to check out. So consider these examples. So these are like common things. They're totally normal for someone to say this after a class. I'm going to coach my team more often, or I'm going to give more feedback, or I'm going to motivate my team to hit their goals. And that's your intention at the end of the class. And that might be great, but it's really helpful to help people turn these into trigger action plans. So instead of saying, I'm going to coach my team more often, okay, what do you mean? Well, when I have one-on-ones with my direct reports, I'm going to dedicate 5 minutes to coaching them toward a goal. Here you have the makings of a habit. Okay, every time I have my one-on-one at the 55-minute mark or whatever it is, I'm gonna launch into the grow coaching model. And I know to do that, and I'm gonna start doing that every time because I have a reliable trigger. Likewise, when my colleagues send me their work to review, I'm going to give them substantive feedback within 3 days. So you have a trigger, somebody sends me some work. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. So trigger action. When we do our weekly team meeting, I'll spend the first 5 minutes recognizing the hard work of specific individuals. It's so much easier to actually live into the trigger action plan than to have this kind of highfalutin goal or I'm going to motivate my team to hit their goals, right? This kind of principle is why I think lawyers ads do work sometimes. So if you've heard a million injury lawyer ads and you know the jingle and you know the phone number, you have a trigger in your head. Oh, I just got into a car accident. I'm going to call this person. Or you might look up and there's a billboard right there, right? So that's the trigger action. In that case, we want to try to create some element of this kind of automaticity into learning. Okay, we're going to launch into Q&A. Before we do, I just want to reiterate that I launched something called People Hat. So if you, again, it's a free service. It takes like 5 minutes to fill out any kind of need that you have, and we'll get you like 5 to 10 high quality proposals that meet all of your requirements. It takes a few minutes, totally free for you. Thank you, everybody. So I think we have some questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to pop this up here before we take those questions. Kaylin, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much, Alex, for everything that you've been able to share today. It's fun to see all the questions coming in and things in the chat. We do have for everybody attending this ebook on Alex's content so that you have a takeaway for today. So feel free to scan that QR code or grab that URL so that you can download that ebook. And then we also wanted to make sure that you knew we have another upcoming webinar on March 27th with the amazing Julie Dirksen on how to support long-term behavior change in L&D. So a great complement to the session and the work that Alex has done today. So hope to see you all there as well. And again, grab that e-learning book if you would like as well. A couple questions that we've got in the chat for you, Alex. One, what are your thoughts on embedding videos in trainings? It's a break from just hearing the trainer talk, but can also lend itself to people zoning out. What's your take?
In general, I don't like it for a few reasons. One is that it's kind of weird that like you're relying on someone else to deliver information that you could deliver yourself. So it's like it kind of creates this juxtaposition between like, well, when we're really trying to motivate you and really inspire you and really get you to learn, we're going to show you this video of Brene Brown talking, or but the rest of the time you're stuck with me. I think another element of is that it often takes a lot of time. And again, you want people in the mindset of we're actively doing something, we're collaborating here. And so we want to quickly get from we're going to do the instruction and then we're going to do the group practice, we're going to do the independent practice, we're going to get into breakout rooms. You want to create that momentum, and having people sit and watch a video is like changes the mindset that people have. Because when I sit and watch a video, I'm a consumer. I'm just chilling out. And so I think it sends the wrong message. That said, if it's super short, if it's like a minute long, maybe 2 minutes at most, I think it's okay.
Okay, yeah, so it seems to kind of align with some of the thoughts shared here by our question asker. Also wanted to see if we could dive into the question, does it make a difference if collaborative learning is delivered remotely, live online versus in person? I think we get that question a lot.
There is no discernible difference except for like logistical things and price. So doing stuff in person just going to cost more. It's going to take more time, and doing things live online is just faster, cheaper, easier, but there's going to be no actual difference in terms of outcomes likely.
The impact and the learning and the knowledge that's going to be taken away.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, perfect. Let's see if we can get to one more in our last two questions here. How do you balance individual learning goals with the collaborative nature of this type of learning experience where you're having people who are coming in maybe with a variety of different needs or experiences?
Yeah, I think helping people like giving them a roadmap that and an expectation that like at the end of every session there's the opportunity to take everything that we've learned and apply it to your personal goals and ambitions. And in the meantime, what we're doing is a group experience. And so definitely apply this stuff to yourself, but you start to get caught up. If people are really focused on themselves, they might be like only asking questions about themselves. Kind of takes time to deal with that in the class. And so, yeah, get people thinking as a group and practicing as a group, and then thinking about themselves more at the end.
Nice. Awesome. Wonderful. I think that's all the questions that we have time for today. Thank you again so much, Alex. This was an amazing session. And everyone, thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at our next one. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.